On the afternoon of September 6, 1976, air traffic controllers at a small civilian airport in northern Japan looked up and saw the most feared aircraft on Earth falling out of the clouds toward them. It missed a commercial airliner, by some accounts, by seconds. It slammed onto a runway built for short-haul passenger jets, blew past the end of it, and tore through the overrun for another 800 feet before it stopped, nose pointed at the perimeter, engines winding down. In the cockpit sat a 29-year-old Soviet senior lieutenant with about 30 seconds of fuel remaining and, by his biographer's account, pages of a classified manual he had brought as a gift. When Japanese airport workers and photographers began running toward the aircraft, he stood up in the cockpit and fired pistol shots into the air to hold them back. Not to protect himself, to protect the machine until the right people arrived. Because Viktor Belenko knew exactly what he was sitting in. For 9 years, this aircraft had terrified the West. It had flown over American allies untouchable. It had been tracked at speeds no Western fighter could reach. It had broken records that stand to this day, and it had frightened the Pentagon into designing and funding the most formidable fighter jet of a generation, specifically to beat it, without anyone in the West ever once seeing what was inside it. And now one of them was parked, intact, on a civilian runway in Japan, with the keys in it. Within weeks, American engineers would take this machine apart down to the last bolt. What they found inside ended a decade of fear in a single classified report, embarrassed two superpowers at the same time, in completely different ways, and then, on second reading, taught those same engineers a lesson in design they never forgot. This is the story of the MiG-25, told the only way this channel tells these stories, through the testimony of the enemy. And stay to the end, because the final document in this file is not a weapons report. It is an invoice, mailed from Tokyo to Moscow, and it may be the driest joke of the entire Cold War. To understand what landed at Hakodate, you first have to understand the fear, because the fear is itself enemy testimony, 9 years of it, written by the West about a machine it had never touched. It began in July of 1967 at the Great Soviet Air Show at Domodedovo outside Moscow, when a new shape thundered past the reviewing stands for roughly a minute. Western attachés in the crowd saw something enormous: twin tails, twin engines, slab-sided intakes like cargo doors, and wings that looked far too big for an interceptor. NATO's naming committee assigned it a reporting word, and the word was Foxbat. Then the records started falling. Under a masking designation, Ye-266, so record books would not confirm what it was, Soviet test pilots took the new machine and began publicly humiliating the stopwatch. Climb records, closed course speed runs near Mach 3, and altitude. In 1977, test pilot Alexander Fedotov would ride it to 123,523 feet, higher than any aircraft has ever flown under its own power before or since. That record is still standing today. Western analysts did what analysts do. They worked backward from the silhouette. That giant wing, they reasoned, meant low wing loading, and low wing loading meant agility. And agility at Mach 3 meant something out of a nightmare, a fighter that could outrun anything, outclimb anything, and then outturn whatever survived. The assessments that circulated in Washington in the early 70s described a superfighter. Then the nightmare left the briefing papers and showed up on radar screens. In the early 1970s, Soviet-flown reconnaissance Foxbats began cruising over the Sinai, over the most sensitive real estate of a shooting conflict, and Israel, flying the best Western fighter of the day, the F-4 Phantom, could not touch them. Phantoms scrambled and watched the contact sail past above them, serene, in the high 70s of thousands of feet. And then came the number. By the usual account, during one of those overflights, radar tracked a Foxbat in a dash at Mach 3.2. 3.2. No Western fighter on Earth could reach it, and the missile geometry against it barely closed. That single tracking report went off in Washington like a fire alarm. What nobody outside the Soviet Union knew, and this is the first crack of daylight in the story, is what that dash had cost. The aircraft made it home, and by the standard account, its engines never flew again. The machine could touch Mach 3.2 exactly the way a man can touch a stove. The West saw the burn, it could not see the burn. And here is what the fear bought, because fear, at Pentagon scale, comes with a budget line. In the late 1960s, the United States Air Force was drafting requirements for its next air superiority fighter, the FX program. And the Foxbat scare leaned on that drafting table with its full weight. The specification that emerged demanded ferocious thrust, a giant radar and dogfighting agility, a machine built to meet and beat the superfighter the analysts had assembled from a 60-second flypast and a stack of worst-case assumptions. The result was the F-15 Eagle, which first flew in 1972 and which would go on to become, by the record commonly cited, the most successful air superiority fighter ever built, with over 100 aerial victories and 0 losses in air combat. Hold that thought with both hands, because the irony matures later in this file. The most feared thing the MiG-25 ever did to the United States was convince it to build the F-15. America spent the price of a revolution answering a question, and on September 6, 1976, the question itself landed in Japan and shut off its engines. The man who delivered it was not a spy and had never spoken to the CIA in his life. Viktor Belenko was, on paper, exactly what the Soviet system wanted: a decorated instructor, a senior lieutenant of the Air Defense Force, the PVO, flying the most prestigious interceptor in the inventory from a base in the Far East. The reality, as he later told it, was a life of frozen garrisons, vodka-soaked despair, shortages, and a service that treated its pilots as remotely piloted components, every maneuver dictated from the ground, initiative treated as a defect. He studied a map of the Sea of Japan and made a private decision. On the morning of September 6th, he took off on a routine training sortie, slid out of formation, and dropped to the deck, under the radar floor, out over the water. Japanese air defense caught a flicker of him coming in and scrambled F-4 Phantoms, which found nothing, because he was down in the ground clutter where the Phantom's radar could not dig. His plan was a military airfield at Chitose. The fuel disagreed. Low, lost beneath cloud, and running out of Soviet Union to return to, he took the airport fate offered: Hakodate, a civilian field with a runway 2/3 the length he needed. Which brings us back to where we began. The airliner missed by seconds, the overrun, the 800 feet of Japanese gravel, the pistol shots over the heads of the photographers. Within hours, the airport was sealed. Within days, Moscow was in full fury, demanding the immediate return of its property, both the aircraft and the lieutenant, and insisting, in a claim it pushed hard, that Belenko had been drugged, kidnapped, that no sane Soviet officer could want to leave. Belenko, asked directly, requested asylum in the United States. And Japan, weighing an enraged superpower against a once-in-a-generation intelligence windfall for its ally, made its choice. The Foxbat was dismantled, loaded onto trucks, and moved under guard to Hyakuri Air Base. And there, a team of Japanese engineers was joined by specialists flown in from the United States Air Force Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson, the unit whose entire purpose was reading the enemy's machines. For the next several weeks, the most feared aircraft on Earth lay in pieces on a hangar floor, and the men who had spent a decade being afraid of it walked its guts with flashlights and notebooks. The testimony that follows is theirs. The first finding set the tone. The airframe of the fastest combat aircraft in the world was made of steel, roughly 80% of it nickel steel alloy, the material of bridges and boilers, with only about 8% of the exotic titanium the analysts had assumed the whole aircraft must be. And the workmanship made the engineers blink. welds laid by hand, and rows of rivets left standing proud of the skin, unflushed, wherever the airflow was judged not to care. The empty weight explained itself immediately. 20 tons before fuel, a fighter heavier than some airliners. Then they opened the avionics bays and found the detail that made this aircraft a legend twice over. Vacuum tubes. The electronics of the Soviet Union's Supreme Interceptor ran not on transistors and integrated circuits, the semiconductors of the age, but on glowing glass tubes, the technology of a 1950s television set. The initial reaction in the hangar, and the men there admitted it, was laughter. Then the engines. 2 colossal Tumansky turbojets with design roots in a missile program. Engines conceived for machines that only fly once, adapted for a machine expected to come home, with overhaul lives measured in mere hundreds of hours. The flight manual pages and Belenko's own debrief closed the case on the magic number. The operational redline was Mach 2.83. The Mach 3.2 that had terrified Washington was real. The aircraft could physically do it, once, as a self-destruct setting with a return address. That serene Sinai dash had cost its engines their lives. Then the range figures, which needed no manual at all, because the proof had delivered itself. Belenko had crossed a few hundred miles of sea and arrived with half a minute of fuel. At full afterburner, the Foxbat drank itself dry with astonishing speed. Its combat radius was a fraction of what a superfighter's should be. And the wing, the great wing that had launched 1,000 assessments, was finally measured for what it was. Not an agility wing at all, but a lifting surface sized to carry 20+ tons to the edge of the atmosphere, on an airframe cleared for only modest G with full tanks. The Foxbat could not dogfight. It was never meant to see another fighter. The classified verdict, when it reached decision level, amounted to this. The West had spent a decade preparing for a superfighter, and the crate contained a dragster. A brute, magnificent, single-purpose interceptor designed to do one thing: launch, accelerate in a straight line, kill a high-altitude American bomber, specifically the Mach 3 B-70 that had haunted Soviet planners, and come home on fumes. And the sting in that sentence is historical. America had canceled the B-70 years before Belenko ever earned his wings. The most feared aircraft in the world had been built to stop a bomber that never existed in service. And the fear of it had built a fighter to stop a superfighter that never existed at all. 2 superpowers, a decade, and billions of dollars, all spent shadowboxing each other's assumptions. If the story ended there, it would be a comedy, and for a few weeks in some Washington offices, it was told as one. But this channel's rule is that the testimony gets a second reading, and the second reading is where the engineers stopped laughing. Take the vacuum tubes, ridiculous, until you ask what a vacuum tube is good at. Tubes are inherently resistant to electromagnetic pulse, the invisible surge of a nuclear detonation that fries delicate semiconductors, which means the Foxbat's electronics were built to keep working over a battlefield where the transistorized West might go blind. Tubes run hot and simple, serviceable by a conscript with basic training at a Siberian base at -40. No clean rooms, no specialists. And tubes can be driven to brutal power. The radar those tubes fed, the Smerch, with reported output around 600 kilowatts, was described at the time as the most powerful radar ever flown on a fighter. A searchlight so violent, it was designed not to finesse enemy jamming, but to burn straight through it. The crude glass bottles were not a confession of backwardness. They were a set of decisions. Now the steel. Titanium was the aristocrat's answer to Mach speed skin heating, and the United States had nearly bankrupted patience and budgets machining it for the SR-71. Steel is cheap, forgiving, weldable by ordinary industry in ordinary plants, and it shrugs at temperatures that would demand titanium's price. The proud rivets stood only where the airflow genuinely did not care. Where it cared, the skin was flush. That is not sloppiness. That is a factory refusing to spend 1 ruble impressing anyone. Even the aircraft's most beloved absurdity obeyed the same logic. The Foxbat carried roughly half a ton of alcohol and water as coolant for its systems, a cargo the ground crews of the Soviet Air Force are reported to have appreciated so sincerely that the aircraft earned the affectionate nickname of the Flying Delicatessen. The engineers who cataloged all of it arrived, in the end, somewhere unexpected: respect. The MiG-25 was not a failed superfighter. It was a masterpiece of engineering to constraint, a machine built by people who knew exactly what they could afford, exactly what their conscripts could maintain, exactly what their doctrine required, and who spent nothing, anywhere, on anything else. Crude was the wrong word for what lay on that hangar floor. Ruthless was the right one. And I will put the formal question where it belongs, in the comments, because the aviation crowd has fought this one for 50 years. Was the MiG-25 a failure that terrified the world by accident, or a masterpiece judged by the only standard that matters, the job it was built for? Pick a side down below and bring your sources. The bill for that September afternoon ran in both directions, and it is worth itemizing. The Soviet Union paid first and worst. A frontline interceptor, its radar, its missiles, its manual, and a serving PVO officer's total knowledge, delivered to the adversary intact. Moscow had to assume every code was burned, and the accounts describe a scramble to rekey identification and communication systems across the entire air defense network, at a cost measured in the kind of money nations do not publish. The Foxbat fleet was pushed through an urgent upgrade program with a new radar to fix what Belenko had exposed, and the deeper fixes were folded into an entirely new aircraft, the MiG-31, the Foxbat's smarter, longer-eyed descendant. And Belenko's debrief cost something harder to repair than codes. He described from inside a pilot culture wired to the ground, every intercept dictated by controllers, initiative bred out, and Western air forces read that testimony and adjusted their expectations of every Soviet pilot they might ever meet. America's side of the ledger reads stranger. The fear had already been paid for, and the overpayment turned out to be the bargain of the century. The F-15, born from a threat assessment the Hakadat hangar quietly shredded, went on to a combat record commonly cited at over 100 victories against 0 defeats. The Foxbat's most consequential kill was extracting the greatest fighter of its era from its enemy's treasury. And Japan closed the account with the driest document of the Cold War. That November, the disassembled Foxbat was packed into crates and shipped back to the Soviet Union. And Tokyo, by the standard account, attached an invoice, roughly $40,000, billed to Moscow for freight charges and damage to airport property. The most feared aircraft on Earth went home as freight, cash on delivery. There is a coda, because this file refuses to end as a joke, and the machine insists on the last word about itself. The MiG-25 stayed in service for decades, nearly 1,200 built, and every so often it reminded everyone of the one sentence in its contract. In the Gulf War of 1991, American F-15s, the very answer built for it, chased dashing Iraqi Foxbats and watched them pull away in a straight line, still 15 years after Hakodate. And on the first night of that war, an Iraqi MiG-25 shot down the F-A-18 of Lieutenant Commander Michael Scott Spiker, later confirmed by the Pentagon as the only American fixed-wing loss in air-to-air combat of the entire war. And that sentence is stated here plainly and left in respect. Years later, in December of 2002, an Iraqi Foxbat met an American Predator drone over the no-fly zone in what is widely described as the first air-to-air engagement between a drone and a fighter in history. The drone fired and missed. The Foxbat did not. And to this day, the absolute altitude record for an aircraft under its own power belongs to the machine the hangar floor was supposed to have humiliated. The dragster kept its one promise for 50 years. As for the man, Viktor Belenko was granted United States citizenship in 1980, and lived out an American life so ordinary it would have baffled his old commissars, consulting, lecturing, driving the roads of the Midwest. His biographer records that in his first weeks in America, walking a supermarket for the first time, Belenko refused to believe it and privately concluded the store was a stage set built by the CIA to impress him, because no real country, he reasoned, could have that much food in one room with no queue outside. He checked other supermarkets. They were all real. He died in 2023, an American of 47 years standing, survived by the record he set at 123,000 feet's expense. The only man who ever stole the fastest interceptor on Earth and handed the fear itself over for inspection. So read the final verdict of this file the way the engineers finally did. The West judged the MiG-25 twice and was wrong both times, first as a superfighter, then as a punchline. And the truth sat between, a machine that told no lies about itself, built by people who could not afford any. The fear was the enemy's finest testimony, and it built the F-15. The hangar floor was the correction. The invoice was the receipt. If someone in your family flew, tracked, or turned wrenches in the Cold War sky, on either side of it, radar operators very much included, their story belongs in the comments of this file, and it will be read. Name the machine the enemy should testify about next, one name down below, and subscribe, because the next witness this court calls is already on the stand. An American bomber that landed in the wrong country at the wrong moment, and the order that followed from the very top. Copy it, exactly, down to the last rivet. An order that gave one nation a strategic bomber overnight, and taught it precisely why you should be careful what you photocopy.